So I think I'll get started, and someone will have to shout at me through the chat if you can't see. I think we're good though. Okay. So today's topic is talking about the basics of ProCROSS. So my goal today is just to give a very broad overview of what ProCROSS is, who we are as a company, and then the basics of what the rotation entails, how to implement it, and then give you some time to ask questions in a general way. So this is a very broad level look at ProCROSS. For the future, we intend to kind of make this into a seminar series. We want to delve into these other topics down the road. Inbreeding and hybrid vigor in a very technical way. So be looking for that announcement coming up next. We also want to do future content talking about selection of breeds for crossbreeding, which breeds we use and why, and which breeds we don't use and why. Then I want to talk some about the research on crossbreeding. We're a very research-rich company and effort. I'll mention a few of those today, but save the bulk of the data part for a future webinar. Finally, some practical applications on implementing your ProCROSS program, and then how to select the bulls within breed that you should be using for ProCROSS. So let me first introduce myself a little bit more to all of you. I grew up on a registered dairy farm in Lanesboro, Minnesota. Minnesota is kind of in the north central region of the United States, and Lanesboro is in the very southeast corner of Minnesota. And if you know where Rochester is, we're not too far from there. So that gives you kind of a geographical picture of my background. Growing up in a registered Holstein herd, I developed that itch for showing cows and really the genetics behind cattle. But then when I went to the University of Minnesota for my bachelor's degree, I got into working into the barns there on campus. And at that time, we had just started with first Jersey for crossbreeding in the university herd, and then with Montpellier later. And those topics really piqued my interest once I got hands-on experience with those cows. But at the same time, I was still involved in the Holstein activities, and especially doing dairy cattle judging across all the major US dairy breeds really enriched my background in all sides of the genetics field. Then I started a master's and PhD degrees with Les Hansen at Minnesota. The projects I worked on there in the research realm included some feed intake data, some phenotypic measurements, and observations on all sorts of work with the Montpellier sired crossbreds we were doing in both university herds, both at St. Paul and then our low input grazing herd in Morris. So those two herds make up our university system currently for the dairy cattle research parts. But then in and amongst that, in 2008, we launched the 10-year Minnesota study on crossbreeding. And it did in fact last from 2008 to 2018. After I finished my PhD technically in 2017, I stayed on a few more years there doing research to finish out that study and get the results published. So as you can see, I've spent most of my career on the research side and working as a scientist. I joined ProCROSS about 16 months ago, and I've really enjoyed working more with our customers and more on the product marketing side now in my current role. So that's a little bit about me. I want to now switch and talk more about ProCROSS and our company. So how it all started. ProCROSS is a really unique idea because it was discovered by farmers and developed by farmers. And it was done out in California with Mike Osmundson and the Creative Genetics of California team. And he worked intimately with a group of herds out there right near Oakdale, California. You can see them pictured here on this slide at our 20-year anniversary gathering. Those herds really took a unique approach to the idea of crossbreeding. they started experimenting with a wide variety of breeds. I want to say upwards of 20 to 30 different breeds. All of the domestic breeds, of course, from the US, which included Guernsey, Milking Shorthorn, US Ayrshire, etc. Plus a wide variety of international breeds, which was really a unique thing to do back in the late 90s and early 2000s, to import semen from these hardly known breeds from across the world. But they wanted to do that because they wanted to give all breeds a fair shot at being successful for crossbreeding. From there, you know, the whole ball kind of got rolling there in California. Eventually, the number of breeds decreased as those dairy producers discovered which ones worked and which ones didn't. Long story short, they got down to the 3 breeds that really worked, and that's when the ProCROSS company was formed internationally by a partnership between Viking Genetics and Copex Montpellier. So ProCROSS is the international company. It serves over 20 different distributor markets across the world. One of those is Creative Genetics in California, and I'm fortunate in my position to be split between both. So I work with our international efforts, doing education and marketing across all markets. I also intimately work with the team at Creative Genetics and our customers here in the US. Let me split up our history a little bit more via a timeline. So in 1999, that's really when this experimentation really began out in California. But at that time, those producers said, it's not just enough to experiment and to make our own decisions. We want to launch a field study because we want the rest of the world to know, are these cows really what we think they are? And if they're great, we want people to know. If they're not great, we want to warn everybody that they should do other things with their breeding programs. So back in 2002, the group first approached actually another group of researchers, but then eventually were referred to Les Hansen at Minnesota to launch this field study comparing those crossbreds to Holstein cows. And actually this first field study included more than just the breeds in ProCROSS. It included 7 breeds to start out with. A couple of those breeds weren't published in the final data just due to the numbers of cows that they eventually had for analysis. But if you'll remember back to that paper that Brad Hines from Minnesota, who's now a faculty in Minnesota, it also included Normandy in the final data. It included some calving data from Brown Swiss early on as well. So then, moving forward into 2007, ProCROSS was developed as this international concept that I mentioned. In 2008, we launched the 10-year study. And then as you can see, we're a very research-focused company. More studies launched, a Danish study here in 2016 comparing Montpellier with Fleckvieh and Holstein. And then we did a feed efficiency study as well. I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. The Minnesota study was completed in 2017 with the final results released and published here in recent years. Today we have 4 university studies in progress. So our mission still includes a focus on university research. And we also are doing internal pilot research on genomics and crossbreeding, which is a very interesting topic to a wide variety of our customers. And we continue to grow in dairy herds across 6 continents and everywhere that that dairy cattle are milked across the world. So let me talk about the breeds used for crossbreeding and how we do the rotation. So to start out with, most herds that we work with, not all, but most, start with a pure Holstein cow. Okay, that's this represented here with this emblem. We breed her to a Viking Red sire, for example, and we get an F1 cross, or we'll call this G1-2 in some incidences, the first generation of crossbreeding. That 2-breed cross then gets bred to Montpellier to make a 3-breed cross, or the G2 in other terms. Now that 3-breed cross will get bred back to a Holstein bull. Let's say we breed her to a Viking Holstein. Now we have the G3 generation here. And think of rotational crossbreeding as just that. It's using these purebred sires in a circular pattern. So then, of course, after we use this Holstein, we go right back up here and we use Viking Red again and start the chain over again and keep doing that in a circular pattern. ProCROSS is also used in the other direction. Actually, in the US, more dairy producers use Montpellier first, typically, to make their F1 cross. And I want to point out here in the slide, these early generations, G1 and G2 of the cross, produce high levels of heterosis at 100%. When we come back with Holstein, we're mixing gene content from this Holstein with our original Holstein foundation cow. And that's why the heterosis level drops a little bit. I'm not going to get very far into the idea of heterosis and hybrid vigor today. However, I do want to mention just comparing a couple different rotations of crossbreeding based on the number of breeds. So this table shows the percentage of the maximum hybrid vigor or heterosis from rotational crossbreeding when you use 2 breeds, 3 breeds, or 4 breeds. Now, just to back up a second, the hybrid vigor, in case you're wondering what I'm referring to by that term, it's the boost in phenotypic performance that we observe, but it's above and beyond the average of the 2 parents. So for example, if we're talking about hybrid vigor of a 2-breed cross, we'll see varying levels of this phenotypic boost above the 2 parent breeds separately, their average, based on the trait. When I say 100% though, that means we're getting the full dose of that hybrid vigor that's possible and that's available. So in the table here, a 1st generation cross is always going to get that maximum dose of hybrid vigor available because you're always breeding a purebred cow to a 2nd breed that shares no immediate gene history. Now, if you go down to G2, that starts changing here with a 2-breed cross because you have to breed back to the parent breed, typically Holstein. So when you hear about a Holstein back cross, that's what this cow is right here. And you can see there's a very large difference in the possible amount of heterosis in that 2nd generation when you choose 3 breeds versus choosing 2 breeds. And like I mentioned on the previous slide, the 3-breed cross never dips below 75%. That's the lowest it goes. And then it levels off up to 86%. So we have a pretty large difference in heterosis when we consider a 3-breed cross over a 2-breed cross. In the later generations here of a 2-breed cross, this amount of heterosis is oftentimes problematic. It's significantly lower than the mid to upper 80s that farmers will experience here with a 3-breed cross. I often get asked the question, what about a 4-breed cross? So here I have that demonstrated, and you can see that the level is a little bit higher than the 3-breed cross in terms of the amount of heterosis. However, we often find that it's very difficult to find a 4th pure breed that's distinctly different from the other 3 that would be adequate enough in the traits that we desire to add to our rotation. Another way to say that is that when we look at the environments of different herds, usually finding 2 breeds and 3 breeds that fit that particular herd environment is a straightforward process. Finding the 4th breed that fits either that high input environment or that grazing environment or whatever it is in between is not so easy. So sticking with 3 breeds in the rotation makes a lot of sense. And besides that, we really want to see each individual breed's attributes come through in the cross. By moving to a fourth breed, now you're diluting down the impact of each of those breeds from 1/3 or 33% of the cross down to 25% of the cross. And when I say that, I guess one thing that I'm specifically referring to is the Holstein. Even though I'm a big supporter of all these breeds, Holstein is really important in just about every crossbreeding rotation we consider. It's a fantastic breed, and it really belongs in crossbreeding rotations. When we go here to a 4-breed cross, we dilute down the content of each breed, including Holstein, to 25%, and that can create some problems. So with that said, that's why we really recommend a rotation of 3 breeds for crossbreeding. I want to introduce the 3 breeds a little bit further with you and why we choose them and what their attributes are. Viking Red is a breed that originates in the Scandinavian countries, namely Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. They have a long and rich history of selecting for health and fertility traits, starting actually back in the late 70s and early 80s. And then by the early 80s to mid 90s, they were incorporating all of these health traits into their genetic evaluation already. So we have over a 40-year history of their selection for general health. More recently, well, actually then clinical mastitis came next, and that was in the early 2000s. Then more recently, actually, they've developed a hoof health index, and they've already been working with that for, I think, 12 years now, which is, moving that selection ahead by a whole decade, ahead of some of the other countries, has really given them a distinct genetic advantage in hoof health. There's been a lot of talk in the last year about incorporating hoof health into US Holstein, but please realize that some of these other breeds have been at it for a very long time already. Another strength of the Viking Red is their calving traits. So they do very well in calving ease and stillbirth, and along with that, daughter fertility or cow fertility. The Viking Red is especially important to the crossbreeding rotation because they have a smaller body size than the other breeds, and especially Holstein. So one thing that attracts people to ProCROSS is that you actually get a reduced frame size on your cows when you incorporate the Viking Red. And then longevity. Viking Red is known as a very hardy and long-lived breed, and that comes through in the cross. They do have quite a bit more longevity, in the neighborhood of 6 to 12 months in most cases. Let's then move to talking about the Montpellier breed. The big strength of pun not intended, is their strength. So Montpellier is known as a strong breed with a lot of width through their front end, a lot of muscling, and a lot of body condition. This is something that's really interesting to look at data on, and unfortunately we don't have a study yet discerning the difference there between body condition and muscling, although I hope that that can be added soon, because they do have both. And adding those things really ties into their fertility. So body condition and fertility are closely related traits, and we know this in research amongst all the other breeds. Cows with more body condition tend to do better in the fertility department. And that kind of ties into health. So all those things interwork together in the same physiological systems. So therefore, it's no surprise that Montpellier is a strong fertility breed. And then they also have excellent calf viability. They're a very adaptable breed. In France, they're really split between 2 major production systems. Half of them are in a very intensive system like we have in the US, freestall herds with cubicles, and in an intensive TMR. But half are also in intensive grazing systems as well. So that makes them a very versatile type of genetic base. And then two, they have much better longevity, more longevity than Holstein, which makes them a bonus. In ProCROSS, we recommend using Viking Holstein for the Holstein content. All Holsteins across the world have excelled in udder conformation. They've really, through the selection history of Holstein, namely in the last 60 or so years, we've really ramped up functional udders in our cows, higher udder floors, and just more milkability across the breed. Also, Holstein is known as the high production breed. They've been intensely selected for high milk solids and for fluid volume. The one big attribute of Viking Holstein that's really an asset for ProCROSS is that they're more of a medium stature type of cow. And we've documented this through the interval comparisons between bulls, that the stature is significantly smaller on Viking Holstein. And so that's really a plus when you look across countries, because all countries really at this point in history are desiring a smaller frame size Holstein. We know through genetic trends that Holsteins are getting too large too fast, and our producers are telling us they want to reduce that body size. So Viking Holstein has more genetic background in that area and is able to get people there. So that's why we like it in ProCROSS. Besides this, Viking Holstein also has done the same trait selection for all those health traits I talked about in the Viking Red breed. And for that reason, also Viking Holstein is preferred as a part of ProCROSS. Let me contrast then the background for the populations of these three breeds in their home countries. Here on the top row, I have their population sizes. And you can see that all three breeds have very large and respectable population size in their home countries, plus more than this actually abroad. And each of these breeds do bring in a few bulls from abroad as well from those other populations. Their milk levels are here. Their fat and protein in kilograms. I apologize to the US folks in the audience today. These are kilograms. If you want to convert it to pounds in your head, simply multiply by about 2.2 and you'll get to what those records would be in pounds. And then fat and protein content. So Viking Red is a very high fat percentage breed compared to the others. When we look at protein, the Viking Red is there also, but Montpellier actually is a very rich protein breed too. And the reason is because Montpellier was developed for a specialty cheese market. And if you ever have a chance to go abroad or even to get to a cheese shop that imports a lot of cheese, try the Comté. It is really top notch. And that's what the Montpellier breed specializes in. On an energy corrected basis, here are then their three levels of production again in kilograms, multiply by 2.2 if you want to think about it in pounds. You'll note here that the Montpellier seems significantly lower than the other breeds. And again, that's because of the production systems that they come from. Like I said a minute ago, half of the Montpelliers are found in grazing systems. So we need to think about how those systems really impact this national average. Maybe the best way for me to describe that is through a series of pictures. So I've been fortunate to visit France a couple of times during my career. And here's some pictures that I took from farms there. This one was during early spring in May, I believe. Cows are out on grass all day except for during milking time. And you can see that here too. These low input herds, when they come in during the winter, they're usually housed indoors for the winter, not because of the weather so much as because the grass just isn't growing because it's a little cool. So they do put up forages, but you can see in this diet that these grazing cows are eating here, it's very stemmy. It's very low quality. They use some byproducts here too, some food byproducts. And generally speaking, it's just very fibrous and filling with not the same energy content that we expect from our high input TMR herds that are feeding a lot of starch. Okay. On the opposite side of the spectrum, here is a high performance Montpellier herd that's housed indoors a majority of the time. And they are in fact eating more of a traditional TMR diet that we would see in the US. More corn, more starch, more corn silage, and more digestible forages. So in these type of herds, we will see production levels exceeding 25,000 pounds, no problem there for the Montpellier breed to achieve that. You could say then that the Montpellier breed has a lot more spread in their production average across the country than some other breeds. And it's not because they're variable genetically. It's not because some of the population underperforms. It's just due to a quite variable environmental system that they use in France. Let me move on to some more content then on crossbreeding. So why is there an interest in crossbreeding, and why does ProCROSS do what it does? The first idea is that we bring in other breeds because we want to introduce the genetic advantages for traits of interest from these other populations. And I just got done talking about some of those in Viking Red and Montpellier. So certain breeds will exceed other breeds for these traits, and we want to be able to mix those genetics across the breeds and create and bring in those other genes that will improve the performance of our animal. We want to, by crossbreeding, we limit the effect of inbreeding depression. So we know that as we select in the pure breeds, the more selection we do, the more inbreeding we create. That's just a function of selection, is that we create inbreeding by default. When we go too fast and too far, we tend to create inbreeding depression. And that's actually a drop in the phenotypic performance of purebred cows as this selection occurs at a very rapid rate. So by crossbreeding, we really eliminate that, that phenomenon. The flip side of inbreeding is that we get the hybrid vigor or heterosis that we already talked about. That occurs when these pure and divergently selected breeds are crossed. And so those are the three fundamental reasons about why we crossbreed. A little bit then on how, on what you should consider as you introduce your optimal crossbreeding plan. I'm totally on board with using 3 breeds in a rotation as ProCROSS promotes, for the reason I mentioned, mainly dealing with the heterosis. It's easy to find 3 breeds that fit most systems. We want to use distinct and pure breeds with sizable populations. If you have a breed with small populations, they're not going to make the same level of genetic progress with time as some of these bigger breeds, and that will be a hindrance to the crossbred as well. And then we want them to have progressive selection programs that are really targeting the traits that are important for your environment. We want breeds then also that are complementary in their strengths and weaknesses. So if you pick 3 breeds that all focus in on the same traits, let's say you pick the 3 highest production breeds you can find. Well, that's awesome for production, and you'll probably achieve really great production. The problem is that today, profitability of herds is a lot more than just the milk check. It's about the costs for those other things, for replacements, for health, and everything else that comes with that, those costs. And in our research that we've documented, we know that those are important because actually reducing those costs boosts the profitability of the entire system. And then finally, the other main tenet of crossbreeding, only using the highest ranking bulls within each breed will give you the optimal cross. So I hear a lot of folks saying, I'm on board with your concept, but I want to use a live cover bull for my program. And the problem with that is just you're not taking advantage of this selection within breed when you don't use a high ranking AI bull. So the ideas and the data we promote and the results that we've shown are all conducted when farms use highest ranking bulls across all breeds. We compare that to Holsteins that are also sired by high ranking bulls across breed, and show you those results. You shouldn't expect that if you're not going to engage in this part of the program. Let's talk a little bit about some research. A big picture idea for ProCROSS is that it's more than just theory. Theory about hybrid vigor is great, but it doesn't mean a whole lot if we can't back it by independent research. And ProCROSS has done that at universities, and that research is also peer reviewed in the scientific community. On top of that, probably the best validation that we get for ProCROSS is from the herds who use it, and they've been doing this over 20 countries and thousands of herd environments. But it all really started here with the research. So the first study I mentioned in California was published in 2012. That study showed that the two breed crosses, they only looked at the first generation in this particular study, a G1 between Montpellier and Holstein and a G1 for the Scandinavian Red and Holstein. That study showed that crossbreds had 4 to 5% more daily profit. I need the word profit there. And that study did ignore health costs. So health costs for these cows is a really big idea and big advantage. So future studies were designed to address that. So we could probably assume then that the 4 to 5% is conservative for the result in that study. Next, we did a comparison in the Denmark in Danish herds. It was a population level study comparing Montpellier and Holstein F1s, Fleck V by Holstein F1s versus Holsteins. And here we found that the Montpellier crossbreds were the best for production. They were also the best for survival amongst the three. A feed efficiency study was conducted at the University of Minnesota, showing a big advantage for lower dry matter intake, but the cows had equal levels of fat plus protein in their milk. And the equality happened in both first lactation and in second and third lactation. But we did find differences for the feed that they consumed. 5% less dry matter intake in first and even more in second. So the feed efficiency is there for crossbreeding. And that study, by the way, was done on ProCROSS in advanced generations of the rotation, past this idea of just looking at a G1 or a G2 cross. These guys were 15 years or more into the rotational cycle. The last study I want to mention is the 10-year Minnesota study. And this is one that I personally worked on through my early career. That study verified that a 3-breed ProCROSS will have 9% more daily profit than their Holstein herd mates. And that penciled out to 120, actually 125 if you round, which I did not do in this slide, $125 per cow per year, more profit above their Holstein herd mates was the amount. So if you multiply that out across these large herds, we're talking meaningful advantages in profit for these herds who use crossbreeding and who use ProCROSS. A big portion of that was this health treatment cost that we were able to track in this study versus the California study that didn't have it. The ProCROSS had 26% lower health treatment cost in their, excuse me, in their advanced lactations. So that was huge and one of the major reasons for the overall profit. I don't want to talk more about the studies in detail here because actually I want to save that for one of our future webinars to go through all that data and the design of those experiments. I do want to sum up today by talking about a few common questions we hear about these broad ideas from our farmers. So a big one I get, and a big one that's logical in most of our minds: how will ProCROSS make me more money? Well, I just touched on that in the last slide. We have the data that shows that ProCROSS cows are bringing in 34 cents more per cow per day than Holstein herds, which amounts to $125 per cow per year. If we include the feed efficiency, which was not a part of that 10-year Minnesota study, and if we apply those same differences, 5% less feed intake for first lactation cows, 8% less feed efficiency for older cows, that it becomes a huge portion of this profit difference, and then the daily profit jumps all the way up to 66 cents advantage per cow per day for ProCROSS. And then there's other parts to this financial equation that we haven't been able to evaluate yet. One of the studies in progress we have right now is about heifer growth efficiencies between Holstein and Viking Red. And we know and expect from the early data that there would be efficiencies there, just like there are when you crossbreed in beef, for example. Well, we see huge hybrid vigor and huge gains in lowering the number of days to finishing on a beef carcass. The biology is the same in dairy cattle for heifers. When heifers grow, you get efficiencies due to hybrid vigor, and especially including the breeds we have for ProCROSS. And then we're also doing more work on the carbon and environmental impact. And that's a really hot topic right now amongst our entire dairy industry, is this idea of how can we capture byproducts from manure and use it for renewable natural gas, take advantage of carbon credit trading and all those sorts of topics. There's really opportunities here for ProCROSS to make headway there, because let's face it, manure is a byproduct of the feed you eat. And when you can decrease your feed, you're reducing impact. And the other part of that coin too is that ProCROSS just last a whole lot longer than their Holstein herd mates. And when you do that, you're growing fewer replacements for your herd. And that really pushes down the environmental impact of growing replacements. So enough there. Another question that I often hear is ProCROSS complicated? How do I implement the breeding system in my herd? Well, actually, it's really not that complicated. The breed of service sire for every cow in every generation is assigned for their whole lifetime. So we're not flip-flopping around to all these different breeds. It's a very systematic way and a systematic rotation. Now, there's a variety of different ways for people to keep track of that. Often people who use a herd management software will just designate something in a special field that says, this animal for the rest of her lifetime gets bred to Montpellier. This animal for the rest of her lifetime gets bred to Swedish Red, and so on. So you're making a field, you're populating the field with only 3 different options, basically, of what that cow should be bred to. When it comes breeding time, your technician can check that field and then pull the appropriate straw from that breed that belongs to her for breeding. Other herds will opt to use a mating plan. There's a lot of different companies out there that offer a mating service, and most of those mating services can accommodate that. We sure can in ProCROSS too in all of our markets. So again, same service sire for that cow for the rest of her lifetime, and it's marked in the mating plan. Thirdly, if that seems a little complicated for your style, a lot of dairies we work with, especially the large ones, will just use an ear tag, and it can even be color coded to make things even easier for the AI technician staff. Let's say, for example, if you put a blue tag in a cow, she gets bred to Montpellier. If you put a red tag in a cow, she gets bred to Viking Red, etc. And you can combine multiple of these different ideas together and use that as a way to double check to make sure you're inseminating the right breed and stay on track with that rotation. How about this one? The genetic progress in the Holstein breed is huge, which it is. I agree with that. Why do we need to crossbreed? Yeah, so genetic progress within each of the pure breeds is very important. If we have a breed that's not making genetic progress, we really should discount them from our consideration, because crossbreeding relies on three things. It relies on good merit within breed, it relies on the hybrid vigor, and it relies on good management, all three of those ideas, okay? So yes, hybrid vigor comes, I'm getting ahead of myself. Hybrid vigor comes on top of the genetic progress within breed. And then as you use those high-ranking bulls, those best genetics that are available within the breed is fixed in the genome of that individual cow. And not only is it hers, but it's in her genetic makeup, and she passes that on to her future generations. And it will always be there as part of the background of her makeup. On the management front, we find through the data that crossbreeding is successful in well-managed herds. It's also successful in the poorly managed herds. But hybrid vigor is expressed equally, and the data shows it's even expressed sometimes at a higher level in those high-performing environments. So you'll often hear out in the field that crossbreeding is for herds that can't manage cows, or it's for a really poor environmental situation. No, it's really for all environments, because that hybrid vigor is captured and it's expressed across all those different herd levels. So then the last one I want to cover is how we implement crossbreeding. So let's say I have a Holstein herd. Which breed should I use first to start ProCROSS? In my experience here on the US side, the overwhelming majority of our farmers will go for Montpellier first and do Monty times Holstein as their G1 cross. There's a couple reasons for that. That Montpellier first is more genetically distant from the Holstein than the Viking Red is. And so for that reason, we get slightly higher levels of heterosis, we think, although we don't have studies to measure this. But we do think that we're getting higher levels of heterosis by using Monty. And so by doing Monty first, you see that right away in the first generation. Historically, Monty has been known as being slightly more difficult on calving, and you might hear that out in the field. We've made vast progress on calving traits for the Montpellier breed, particularly in the Copex brand through our own proprietary selection. We've worked really hard on the calving traits compared to the competitor Montpellier brands. So even so, when you use Montpellier on a Holstein for your first cross, be sure to choose a calving ease bull on your heifers, or use sex semen. The reason I say that is because you do get the hybrid vigor for calving when you crossbreed, but remember that Holstein herself is the dam that's going to give birth to this calf. She doesn't have hybrid vigor for her own ability to deliver a calf. So we need to give her some protection by using calving ease bulls here. Now, some herds will opt to use Viking Red first, and there's differing opinions on this. This is just my opinion, and generally what happens for creative genetics here in the US. But some people will go to Viking Red first because it really reduces body size. So if you're in a older type of facility, or you have smaller stalls, and you need a shorter and smaller bodied cow, the Viking Red is the place to go first to really reduce that body size. Plus, the Viking Red is a very hardy cow. So if you already have problems with your dry cow and your transition management, And those problems are causing difficult calvings in your Holstein herd already. And you struggle with metabolic problems too, by the way. Go to Viking Red first. It will create easy calvings because Viking Red is known as the easy calving breed of the two. Now, I want to say though, to make things easy and uniform, we only recommend picking one of these two directions. So either pick Monty first or pick Viking Red first. Don't do both within the same herd, okay? The reason I say that is because your life will be so much easier if you only do the rotation in one direction, and it will make that whole mating system much simpler overall. The idea with ProCROSS is we want things to be simple. We don't want to have to mate individual cows. We did that with the pure breeding side. We want to get away with that and just keep it simple with rotating 3 breeds. And we do that by only picking one direction of the rotation. A secondary reason to do that is, you know, when you do the rotation in one direction, all of a sudden your cows look and seem a lot more consistent. If you have if you have the G1 of both this type and this type, they're going to look like 2 very different cows out in your pen. And you're going to kind of get that idea that the consistency isn't there. Really, these types of crossbreds are very consistent within each other, but they're different from each other, if that makes sense. So within cross variation is low, between cross variation is somewhat high. So if we do it in one direction, we get more consistency within our cow herd during those early generations. Okay. With that, I will stop lecturing at you and I want to discuss with you. We'll take some questions here from the audience. And if I don't get to your question, here's my email address, or if you want to pick up a conversation with me later, feel free to email me anytime. I'm going to stop sharing, I think. Okay. Let me go first to the Q&A. And the question here, contrast Viking Red versus Norwegian Red. Does it come down to sire selection? Is one better than the other? Yeah, that's a really good question. So Viking Red, like I mentioned, is from the three countries. It's a joint breeding program between Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. Norwegian Red, obviously by its name, is from Norway. So the first thing to think about is that they're different breeding programs and their selection criteria is different. Viking Red has documented that they are a stronger breed in the production traits, all of milk, fat, and protein. And we can do this because we've been able to compare through interval the genetic levels of the sires, of proven sires, okay? So Viking Red is better on production traits. That's been documented. They're also better on udder conformation. And when you crossbreed, it's really important that we hone in on those 2 trait groups, especially. They are high heritability traits and traits that get lower benefits from the hybrid vigor. So they're important for crossbreeding. So it's important that we pick the breed within the breed cluster. In this case, we're talking about the red breed cluster that excels in those areas. Norwegian Red has some strengths that they've emphasized in their breeding program. They've worked on polled for an awful long time. They've also really selected hard on health traits and particularly on fertility for the same amount of time that the Viking Red has. So they do very well on the fertility department. But the reason that I stick with Viking Red, even all those things considered, is because we get high amounts of hybrid vigor we get high amounts of hybrid vigor for fertility, and that comes through from that portion. I don't feel as much need to select for hybrid vigor or for fertility in each of the purebred populations for that reason. Does it come down to sires? There probably are a few good bulls within any of these breeds, but for the vast majority of customers, it's so easy just to pick one breed for the purpose of acquiring inventory and comparing bulls within breed. You can't really, it's very difficult to compare bulls across breeds and just hand pick the ones you like, okay? Because you're on different country systems and different evaluation scales too. So that's why Viking Red is part of the ProCROSS system and not Norwegian Red. Some of the early California study we did actually included all of Scandinavian Reds, including Norwegian Red. And after time went on, those California producers stuck with the Viking Red, and for the reasons that I described. Okay. The next question we have from international here is, can we add a fourth breed like Gir for hot countries like Pakistan? So there are special circumstances in which certain breeds add different things. In this talk, I didn't really have time to get into some of the disease issues that we see, like in Brazil, where the cross called Girolando is very popular and well appreciated, because that Gir breed that I'm describing is a Bos Indicus breed, and they have both heat tolerance and they also have the disease resistance. So, you know, ProCROSS is really developed for that that northern hemisphere type of climate, but they also do well in the southern hemisphere in more moderate disease conditions. So I wouldn't select Gir just for heat tolerance. I would select it if you need both heat tolerance and a special disease resistance type of environment. Okay. But with all these crosses, it's important to think about the environment you're working in. ProCROSS, we've tested across lots of different environmental conditions in all these countries, and it works well there. ProCROSS has been tested in Pakistan, like you asked here in this question, and it does well there too. Okay. Next question from Victor: could I use Ayrshire instead of Viking Red? I kind of answered that when talking about Norwegian Red, and it's the same type of answer here. Red breed, I think, belongs in just about every crossbreeding system, but there are differences between the red breeds. Actually, I want to highlight that in a future webinar when we talk about why we picked Viking Red for ProCROSS and not any of the other breeds. There are genetic differences for the level. And Viking Red does rank over Ayrshire definitely for the production traits for milk production. And when we're talking about commercial cows, you know, those production traits are still really important. Okay, so that's why I like them over the other flavors of Ayrshire that are out there. Derek asks, you mentioned starting with a Holstein herd and going to ProCROSS. What about starting with a Jersey herd? And yeah, that's a really great question, Derek. We have herds that start on Jersey for sure. When you start, one reason that they will go that way, well, that they will come from Jersey, is because it's very common to experiment with Jersey out the gate and then realize that crossbreeding with Jersey didn't work out. What if you start with a pure Jersey herd? I think maybe, Derek, you're asking, if I start with pure Jersey, what breed do I use first? I would go to Holstein first in that case. I don't really like the Holstein Jersey cross per se, but it works well as a first cross. You really need to introduce that high milk volume and high milk production, and the Holstein will bring that. From there, it's kind of a toss up. Once you have a Holstein Jersey, if you want to reduce body size back down again, go to the red. If you're okay with a bigger cow and you want to get more body condition on that cow, go to the Montpellier. I don't have a strong preference in either way. The idea with starting with Jersey, though, then is to just move that Jersey back in the pedigree and move on to the ProCROSS breeds. So I hope that answered that question.
Amy?
Yes.
We have a question from Facebook from Abu Bakr. asking for in the future when we cross between medium stature Holstein with Viking Red, which is shorter, as you said. Will we not do we have shorter animals, and can we find a solution regarding that?
Yeah, great question. I mean, so there is a pure breed size difference, obviously, which I think the question is alluding to. One way we address that is by inspecting individual bulls within breed and trying to adjust the size of those individual bull selections. Our company's developed a system called ProCROSS ranking. And what the ranking does is it emphasizes certain traits that we need in the ProCROSS from those pure breeds. For Viking Red, one of those traits is emphasizing the taller, larger frame size bulls within Viking Red. And what that does, as has been alluded here, is it helps to get that stature level just a little bit higher and helps to moderate stature across your 3-breed program. Because the idea here is uniformity, right? The Viking Red adds to the equation in that it does bring the stature of the entire cross down, but we want to moderate it as much as we can. So that's why I would recommend going for a slightly larger frame size Viking Red, a smaller Viking Holstein, and then sticking to the moderate to smaller Montpelliers will really help to moderate the body size across the generations. In our data, we've been able to pull that apart to some degree. And in those early studies, actually, we didn't actually have restrictions on sire selection in that way. And even so, the frame size actually was surprisingly consistent across the generations. But we think we can help it even more by giving the edge to some of these bulls in a small way and making sure we pick the bigger of the Viking Red bulls when possible.
Thank you for your answer, Amy. We have another question also from Boubacar from Facebook. When it comes to G2 and G4, will the hybrid vigor reduce, and will it affect the production and health?
Yeah, great question. So in theory, as I showed in that slide where we had the percentage of maximum heterosis by generation, yeah, it does reduce. In the G4, it goes down to as low as 75%. Now, this is an estimate, and it's not going to be the same for every cow. It depends what genes that the cow contributes and what genes the bull contributes and how they admix with each other. So 75% will be the average, but it will vary from mating to mating. So that's one thing to keep in mind. I say all that because it might not be apparent when you're inspecting individual cows that your heterosis has dropped by 25% in an individual cow. I think you would notice, like I showed in that table where I had the 2-breed, the 3-breed, and the 4-breed, you will notice generation over generation and cow over cow, that 67% difference versus the 86. That's a pretty big discrepancy across the entire herd. When we look at the data through ProCROSS going by generations, we were able to do that in the 10-year Minnesota study. We took the early look at the Holstein sired G3, which had the lowest heterosis and also the highest Holstein content. We did not see significant drops in fat plus protein production. We did not see significant drops in fertility and health traits, although those were first lactation cows. We see more of the health stuff in older cows. But no, we don't expect to see big drops due to the lack of heterosis, really. That's the beauty of a 3-breed system, is that you're maintaining that moderately high heterosis level generation to generation.
Thank you, Amy.
Yeah. If there's any more questions, I'll give you just a minute to add them to the Q&A here or the chat. Actually, I'd prefer you use the Q&A if you would please. Or like I said, I will take any and all questions and be happy to have a discussion with you one-on-one afterwards. Feel free to email the address. I'll put my address here in the chat too. Okay. I don't see any more. Bastian, thank you for those questions from Facebook. And I'd like to thank all of you in the audience today for joining us for this seminar. Stay tuned to our channels and we will advertise more in this series on ProCROSS in later months this winter. I hope you can join us. Have a good day, everybody.